All right, I'm recording on my end. Let me know when you're good.
Okay, I think I'm recording now too.
It should say top in the top
Yep,
left-hand corner. It should say recording on your screen.
yep.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So welcome to a podcast that I'm going to host. My name is Beau Larimer. I am an English high school teacher at Independence High School, and I am going to chat with Dr. Josh Kunnath today, who teaches at Highland. So before we get into it, just a brief little bit of background on myself, and then I'll focus on introducing my guest. So like I mentioned, I teach at Independence High School. I've taught there for 7 years. The past 3 or 4 years, I've had a chance to teach at our local university here in Bakersfield, California State University of Bakersfield. And in this jump to the digital platform and the current situation with coronavirus in 2020, I've started a podcast for a class that I teach college students there, which is basically a class looking at the craft of teaching high school English. So enough about me. I would like to introduce our guest with a couple questions for him. So I'll just call you Josh. I think we talked about this last time. Oh, by the way, with the jump to digitized learning, it's been a wild ride. We tried to do this last week on April Fool's Day, and technology did not go the way that I hoped it would. So this is take two. Hopefully, we discover some of the same wonderful insights this second time. Anyway, Josh, I was just going to ask you kind of what your educational journey, what your story is to begin with.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Beau. And yeah, I think last week's session was good practice for this week. So my name is Josh Kunnath, as mentioned, and I teach at Highland High School. This is my 12th year teaching there. I teach English. Currently teach 11th grade college prep English and also AP English language and composition. I'm the department chair there. I have a educational doctorate in educational leadership, and really my specialty as far as writing and researching and kind of helping teachers is with grading, assessment, and feedback. So I'm happy to be here today, and especially excited to talk to future teachers, because this is some stuff that it's just these topics in general I would have loved to talk about and to think about and to hear about when I was preparing to be a teacher. And unfortunately, I pretty much didn't have a chance. I did about assessment, but not on grading. And so I'm glad, I'm hoping I can be of service.
Yeah, and I think as my teaching's improved, it's really tied back to the question, to what end? And I think sometimes with grading, people tend to tie it to a different end than facilitating student learning and best practices in teaching. As we get into it, we'll really look at grading, facilitating the good practices of assessment and feedback without causing equity issues, which we'll get into later. You're a man of many hats, though. You primarily talk about working at Highland. You got your doctorate on grading, correct?
Well, my doctorate's in educational leadership. My dissertation was on the topic of grading. So I first started kind of investigating grading. Now, a lot of my investigation started back maybe about 8 years ago or so, with some issues that I experienced firsthand myself. So my dissertation was on grading and the impact that poverty can have on teacher grading practices, and so I do a lot of work with that, like you mentioned, and then I also am the editor of an academic journal. It's an open access online journal. It's called Journal of School Administration, Research and Development, that primarily publishes research on education leadership.
Awesome. And I always enjoy following you on Twitter. You have great insights and discussions there, and link to awesome articles I'm always reading. And your blog as well. I've read pieces that you published there. So I'll link several of those things below when we publish this to YouTube later on. All right. Is it okay if we kind of dive on into the meat of what we're going to talk about today?
Let's get into it.
Okay. So the first, refer to my some of the ideas. Oh yes, so the first thing I really wanted to talk about, and I really enjoyed when we talked about this last week, was it looking at grading alongside the terms of assessment and feedback. I know personally as an educator myself, oftentimes I tend to think about grading as, oh, this grade is serving the purpose of giving feedback to the student, or looking at it, this grade is the assessment, and it's very formalized, graded product, and that's what assessment is. And that's kind of conflating concepts and parts of the teaching craft that are very different. So do you mind getting into a little bit? I like to start with assessment, especially the difference between formative and summative assessment, and then move to feedback in a second. Could you talk about what those terms mean and kind of what purpose they serve?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question, a great place to start, Beau. And just holistically, big picture, basically, I would say that assessment and feedback, these are essential parts of the teaching and learning process. Grading is not, but assessment and feedback, these are, they're essential, they're ongoing. And so assessment is just gathering evidence of student learning. That's all it is. So gathering evidence, and then we're using that in different ways. Now, in two major different ways, but the primary form of assessment that we want to be using continuously is formative assessment. And so in formative assessment, we are gathering data, again, continuously, multiple times every day, every class period, about kids' level of learning within the learning process. It's just where they're at on a day-by-day basis in that learning progression, and sometimes even, near moment-to-moment basis, as much as we can. And again, it's just gathering that information, and what we do with that is we want to kind of instruct our own teaching and our own instructional decisions, and also to allow kids to know where they are at, and so they can be active in the learning process. So again, formative assessment, it's gathering that data, it's within the learning process, it's throughout that entire unit, and we're doing that continuously, and we want to bring kids in as part of that as much as possible to get them to be the center of that learning process, to have that student-centered classroom.
Yeah, and we're going to get into this later. You do not grade at this point now your formative assessment, correct?
I do not. So I don't grade formative assessment. I don't grade, which can show up in lots of different. So let me just give you some examples of formative assessment, because I think for teachers, whether they're experienced or not, I think the number one thing that comes to their minds in formative assessment is the quiz, right? And oftentimes I think too, it's like the more structured and the bigger quiz, and almost like close to a test, because we use the initialism CFA, Common Formative Assessment, and we tend to make these really formal, and we tend to these are made commonly, hence the C and CFA common, and that's good. We want to be common, but they tend to be almost like practice tests and like these big events, these assessment events. That can be a form of formative assessment, but it doesn't need to be that way. My definition I just was kind of sharing was anytime we're collecting evidence. So that could be a classwork assignment, could be a homework assignment, could be a student just talking to the person next to them, pair sharing, right? It could be them modeling something. It could be an exit slip. It can show up in lots of different forms. And so we collect this in so all these things that I just explained is just examples of formative assessment. I don't grade any of those, including homework, classwork, and all that stuff.
Right.
But again, I think we're kind of jumping ahead.
Yeah. And just to kind of broadly, before we get into it later on, you do that primarily because you want to emphasize formative assessment as a tool to position you for better teaching, and a tool for the students to really focus on the learning experience and quality practice, rather than searching for a particular grade, right?
Yeah, that's right. I do that because I want grades to have real meaning, and I'm going to get into that in a minute about what I use as a definition of grades, and really all the researchers out there do as well. And I don't want grades to get in the way of the learning process, because we know that grades, they have so much emotion in them, and when kids are thinking about grades, usually they are not thinking about grades and learning at the same time. They are mutually exclusive, pretty much. It's one or the other. And so I want to focus the formative assessment with learning, and keep grading at the end where I think it really deserves to be.
We've kind of focused on formative there. Could you talk about how summative is different than formative assessment?
Yeah, so again, formative assessment, this is the key. This is the primary form of assessment that we want to be using, but summative assessment is very important too. Summative assessment is when we are assessing students' level of learning at the end of the learning process. And that's it. It's at the very end. So, when we design, when we design our units, we design them in a specific time frame where we think, as we're going through the learning progression, when we're teaching and the students are learning that, a majority of our kids, the vast majority of our kids will be able to learn at probably a proficient level by a certain moment in time. And at that time, we're going to give them a summative assessment because it's what we see as the end of the learning progression. So it's at the end, and that's what we use to decide the extent to which they've learned the priority standards that we previously determined in our learning teams, really, ideally, of what's essential for kids to learn, and therefore we only assess on those essential standards. And
Right.
again, it's at the end. Now,
Yeah.
I think importantly, at the end of that unit, it's entirely possible. In fact, in my experience, it always happens that what a summative assessment turns into a formative assessment if a student has not yet learned to the proficient level, which I want all my kids to do at least the proficient level. So I allow them to retake, and therefore that becomes formative. And I use that just to determine where they're currently at and where they need to get to. And giving them that information, we decide collectively how they get to that point that they need to go. They're allowed to then retake later, and that retake is going to be the summative. The original summative turns into a formative assessment.
Yeah, essentially a diagnostic, right? A diagnostic setting up, hey, here's how we need to push further. Because diagnostic assessment essentially is summative, right? You're seeing, hey, what's the fixed point of what they've learned so far?
Right. Yeah. And typically I would use a diagnostic at the very beginning of the unit just to determine where kids are at before we start the entire learning process. So I know what I don't need to waste my time on or their time on, so I can make sure that they're as engaged as possible. But yeah, it does really, it can serve as some diagnostic capabilities at the end of the unit, I guess, in terms of determining where we need to go next. Because if they're continuing that learning process after the initial summative event, really it's going to be a personalized learning experience, because most likely the rest of the class, we're going to go on to the next unit. And so I'm going to be doing one-on-one work with the student, and they're going to be doing other things outside the class. So I need to make sure that I get as much evidence as possible to guide them in that learning experience and to really learn from those mistakes that they made previously, so they can catch up as soon as they can at the same time, because they have to continue on with learning of the next unit.
Right. What was I going to say? Oh, so to recap, summative, how well they're learning, right, to really position for better instruction and better practice. Summative, how well, it's really not how well are they learning, it's what have they learned. Would you say that that's an accurate summarization of that?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, and then I feel that when assessment's used correctly, it really positions feedback to be effective. Could you define feedback a little bit, and also how assessment really sets up the quality of the feedback?
Sure. And let me just add one little thing about assessment too, but I think it gets right into feedback as well. So one of the really important things that as teacher teams that we need to do when we're creating these assessments is to really do our best as educational professionals. And I think, first of all, not to get too much of a side note, but I think too often teachers do not really fully embrace the idea of being an educational professional. I think we really need to do that, not to undersell ourselves. And part of being an educational professional is being able to create valid and reliable assessments. And that sounds kind of a fancy term. And nobody is expected to be, well, most of us, are not expected to be psychometricians here. But a valid assessment, all that means is we're gathering evidence that really accurately portrays the learning that we're looking to get. So it really, the evidence of the student learning is truly evidence of those targets and those standards that we intend to collect. So that's really important that we do that as best as possible, and we have conversations and we use literature to try to make that determination of valid assessments. So once we're pretty sure that we've been able to do that, and we are collecting evidence through formative assessment, well, the next stage after that is of course we're making our instructional decisions, but we're giving students continual feedback, right, of where they're at, what they need to do next. Right? Descriptive feedback as much as possible, and ideally, I think we use rubrics along the way in all subjects, but I mean especially English. So we've made very clear the learning targets for students, and so I just think it's really important that the feedback aligns to those rubrics that we use.
Right. And I think that, I mean, that's why formative assessment is so important. Is it in taking away the grades, it helps focus on the instructor saying, okay, I'm collecting this assessment to position for feedback, rather than worrying, okay, I'm collecting this assessment to motivate with a grade. Sure. Moving kind of now into grading, could you define grading and how you would differentiate it from those two first concepts we talked about, which I think I know for myself, in my earlier understandings would mix those two together too often, where having the separate idea for it is more effective.
Yeah, sure. So, and I've learned the hard way on a lot of these things. I've made tons of mistakes myself. But so grading, I think it's really important that we start collectively with a definition of the purpose of grading. In my experience, some of the biggest problems that come with teachers and disagreeing on grades, or teachers and students, let's say, or teachers and parents or administrators, is we're not starting with the same definition of grading or the same purpose of grading. So really what the research very clearly tells us, it's very well documented for a long, long time, decades of research, is that the primary purpose of grades really should be to communicate student learning of prioritized learning targets or standards. And the primary audience of this evidence should be to students and parents. So that's it. That's what grades are for. Not for motivation, right? Not for discipline, not for whatever purpose. It's just to communicate student learning. And it really helps us simplify and streamline the process. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, the purpose of grading, the definition, when we make our grading decisions, so that we are purposeful in our teacher decision making, which we always should be. But we just got to start with those definitions. Right.
Hey, I had the chance, and I credit a lot of overhearing you talk about it, and you sharing some of your insights with me. I had a chance at the CATE conference, California Association of Teachers of English, to write a resolution on equitable grading. And you pointed me in the beginning process of research and writing that piece to a very key book. It looks like you do have it at hand. Could you share that book real quickly? You've actually had a chance, I think, to talk to the author himself. Could you share how that piece has informed some of your own learning in this element of reform, this grading element, and in your own practice?
Yeah, sure. I have a few books I was hoping to kind of share here, Beau, right next to me. So
oh yeah, no problem.
Convenient that you brought that up. So, but no, for this book, Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman, it's I do highly recommend this book, and it really helps, I think. So I use this as a framework of my grading reform this year, this school year, both for myself in my own classroom and with a team of teachers that I'm leading through grading reform. And what I like about it is it really clearly lays out elements of effective grading in terms of accuracy, but also more importantly, I think, hence the title, in terms of equity. And so what author Joe Feldman does is he presents what he calls 3 pillars of equitable grading. And these 3 pillars are accuracy, bias resistance, and motivation, and a bunch of practices and policies that go along with that. And so I think it's very clear in how he lays it out, lots of examples and theory there too. So I would suggest that, along with a few other books that maybe I'll get a chance to mention later. And it's been helpful for me. I think it's been helpful for other teachers. And it was, and again, you made that grading resolution, which I think was a great resolution, and hopefully get more people to just to know about it.
Yeah, I'll link that in. I'll link some of the titles you mentioned, and then remind me as we kind of close this this discussion that to add, kind of throw up, hey, further research, look at some of these books.
Yeah.
So awesome. So I'm going to move kind of now into that topic. Now that we're moving into it, grading, right, is different than assessment and feedback. But doing grading the wrong way can interfere with teaching, the best practices of teaching, and can hinder the assessment process and the student practice, and the feedback, especially if it's the wrong types of practices are spreading larger than just one classroom, which I think when you look at traditional grading, people go, what's the traditions? And they fall back into that without thinking about the question, to what educational end, which I think is really important. So kind of moving now a big part of our discussion, talking about issues that you see in traditional grading, and then what equitable solutions and ways to address some of these issues are. At this point, is there any part of the slides you want me to put up?
Yeah. So, Beau, just one thing real quick that you just brought up, and I want to just say something else on that just a little bit, because I think it's worth saying, especially to future teachers. Something I think this is kind of a word of warning that that I think I tried to keep in mind after my first couple of years of teaching, once I realized the problem, and which is we have to be wary about traditional grading practices. One of the problems is with teacher preparation schools and things of that sort is too often teachers are not educated on how best to grade. So it's pretty much trial by fire, right? We just grade the way they work because we have to create grades, and sometimes we can ask if we're comfortable, we can ask other teachers who maybe are on our learning team or are next door or whatever it is, and these may or may not be good recommendations. In fact, I'm going to say that the probability is that they're probably traditional grading practices. They're probably not necessarily the best practices if we just try to rely on our own experiences in the classroom, right? One of the interesting things about education is everybody has had experiences with grades, and sometimes we just assume that that's the way it is because that's the way we've experienced it. So we have to just be careful. And I would say my word warning is to not default to that kind of a mindset. Push yourself, and now that you have a chance, because I'm talking to teachers here, future teachers, it's coming up in this class and hopefully in other classes too, about grading and what it should be and what it shouldn't be. Resist the temptation to default back to the way that you were graded yourself, because it probably was poor practice. I'm just going to throw it out there. It was probably poor practice. It probably, those grades probably had little meaning. Now, I'm sure some had more meaning than others for sure, but that's just the way that it's been in our country, unfortunately, for over 100 years. And so what that means is not only ourselves, and for you, future students, or it's also your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents. And so it's just been going on for too long. Now, luckily, I think grading reform has gotten a lot more attention in the last 5 years, and I think it's going to continue to do that. So just keep that in mind when you hear from, the seasoned veteran, or they have some kind of handy tips for you and what to do and what not to. Just ask them, push back. What's the research on that? Where have you read about that? Not just this is why we've always done it that way. It's just how it is.
Yeah, and to add to that, the idea of this, so we're going to talk about a lot of things in a second that are very systemically different than the way traditional grading has been done. And I think as you revise and improve teaching in year 7, there's things I did this year that I hadn't done the last 6 years, but also that I don't think I was quite ready to take on. I know you're going to talk about some of your reforms. You didn't take on every single reform that was possible, right? So you do what you can to improve, and you see where you can push that improvement. But as a teacher, you do the best you can, and you do improve on that the next year and the next year and the next year. It's not always complete revision of a whole system. It's these small pieces, and that the idea of you try and get 5% better each year, not these wide systemic changes, and always, like you mentioned, position those changes from a place of research and knowledge, and not just what has been done before, what the person next to you is necessarily doing. And moving on into our discussion, I want to echo what you say, and I've done, talking to you, I've done things different with my grades, but if my college students are, when they're watching this, and if one of my high school students stumbles on this YouTube video, is watching it and goes, will go, huh, that's what he's talking about is not the way you're grading us, Mr. Larimer. And that's true. I did not completely revise all of my the way I've graded in the past. I've each year tried to push towards a more equitable approach, and really all of my grading, I try to strive towards that. It's going to support student practice, it's going to support student learning. It's in their best interests, and it's going to be equitable. So I think that's something you really have to pursue, but pursue in kind of a measured approach. So I would like to kind of move into one of the first issues with grades. Do you want me to throw up any part of the slides?
Yeah, sure. So slide 13, so with problem 1, if you have that available
slide
there.
13, rehearsed this Zoom move many times. Let's see if I can pull it off. Okay, here we go. Give it a second. So does your screen look different? I know mine does.
Yes, but that is slide 21. So
I see it up
there.
Let me move the slides. Okay. I just wanted to transition. Do you see yourself and myself in your slides?
Yep.
Okay, so 13, yes?
Yeah, it should be 13.
I'm on the right direction. I am.
And so I'll just start talking here if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, go for it.
So the first big problem, I think, is about, and Beau, it should be the next one.
Next one, gotcha. Yes, we're going to zoom into a couple big issues. One of them we're going to talk about kind of together. The disclaimer, problem 1, yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, is something that Susan Brookhart in, oh geez, I've forgotten the year now. Susan Brookhart in, I believe it's 1994. I might be a couple years off, but she termed the hodgepodge grade. And I think this is just a great way to kind of classify traditional method of grading, is that just a grade, we just question what it really means, because there are so many things that go into the traditional grade, and that it loses the meaning. So when I'm bringing up these questions, these problems rather, I want you to think in your mind again, that definition I gave you about what grades you really should mean, and they should communicate student learning, and it's for students and parents. And so if we have things like homework and participation and effort and behavior and quizzes and tests, and we put it all together in a single grade, right? And this is the traditional way. Then what does the grade really mean? Now, what does it really mean? I'm not looking for a rationalization, but it doesn't really mean anything.
In terms of specificity, especially, right?
Right. So, and I think we have to be careful with that, because I hear a lot of teachers say, well, it's 70% homework maybe, and 30% assessment, summative assessment, or percentages and things like that, which make it sound accurate. But that's actually, I think that's it's kind of a mirage of accuracy, because if we want, here's the fact, here's the bottom line, if we want, which we should, grades to represent student learning, we know the best tools that we have available to ourselves is summative assessment, period. That's it. And therefore, one of the most essential, I think, reforms, but one of the toughest for lots of educators, is transition the grade to be entirely constructed of summative assessment. And all those other things are not in the grade, because when you have them all in the grade, as I said, it really makes things the grade very murky and unclear. And there are lots of problems with this. So in addition to the really inaccuracy, is what we're talking about here, is the lack of accuracy, there are really big equity issues here too. And so, the equity issues could come in a lot of different places. Let me just give you one specific example. Let's say about effort, right? Because we know effort, teachers like to use effort in the grades in different ways. Teachers especially like to use effort when it's a borderline grade, right? They're like, and it's really close to the next grade, and maybe the student comes in and say, okay, what can I do to bring up my grade? Or the students, teachers are sitting at the computer and entering grades that's really close, and they're considering if it should go up to the next grade or not. Here's the problem with effort, though. How do you measure effort? What do? You look at them and see like how closely, I don't know, how fast the student's pencil is moving, or how often they raise their hand, or is that effort?
And even if
you can't do that accurately.
Yeah, and even if you're measuring effort, right? Even if you're measuring it accurately in the hodgepodge grade, right? You want the grade to be specific to this. If it says your writing ability at the top of the grade, right, and you're looking at effort, that's behind good writing, but that's not directly what you're measuring.
Right. Yeah, there's a correlation there, right? But it's not necessarily causation. So the follow-up to why that's an equity issue is because, to me, I have some sort of idea in my head. We can all say, well, I can kind of tell what effort looks like. But that's based off of our own construct of effort. That's based off of our own experiences ourselves, the way in which we were raised, the place in which we were raised, right? So I happen to come from, born and raised in Metro Detroit in Michigan, right? And so, what it looks like there, and so known as a blue collar city, and people, working in auto plants and stuff like that. So I truly value high effort, but I don't keep that in grades. I know I would be especially biased if I had effort in grades, because I think, and I used to coach football, and I thought that was one of the most important things. It was high effort, and that's part of my self-image, I think. And then that's
so entrenched though in the philosophy, right? You have euphemisms like A for effort, right?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So we want to keep it accurate. We want to keep it equitable. And when we put all the stuff together, it's not either of those things. So we want to keep it specific. So here's the solution. This is a problem. The solution is very simple initially, but there's a lot of follow-up and implications. The simple solution is make grade 100% based off of summative assessment. Now, here's a couple things real quick, because there's really a lot to go into this to make it work. And that's the thing, too, about grading reform. And this is why I say it's really a high leverage kind of reform, is because every fix that you make to grades, every sort of reform that you make, there are follow-up changes that you need to make to your own to your own teaching practices, which will make your other elements of your teaching just that much stronger. So a couple of things that you need to follow up is, here's the couple of questions that I get first right away when I made the switch to 100% summative assessment. Number one is, doesn't that put a whole lot of pressure on kids for summative assessments? What about the kids who get really nervous during tests? And, that just puts more stress on them. And it can, but that's one of the big reasons why I allow students to retake until the end of the semester. Until the end of the semester, they can show their learning. And so what I found is that takes off a lot of the stress, and also allows kids to know, like, hey, we're in it for the long haul. It's not just like, let's get through these 4 weeks of this unit, and then I'm not good at this, so I'm just going to get on the next thing. It really helps to facilitate a growth mindset. But those things go back and forth, I think, really. It takes a growth mindset to make this work, but having these types of policies help to facilitate a growth mindset as well. So that's one thing,
Yeah, you can't have the power of, to the growth mindset, the power of yet. You can't tell the kid, there's some good pieces there's some good elements there in your writing, but you're not quite there yet if you don't allow them to show that yet later on. Right.
Yeah. So, well, I'll keep it there just for the sake of time, but that's one of the big things is allowing retakes, and that's really a must. The second question, though, that I get with is, well, okay, so all right, you give unlimited retakes until the end of the semester. That's great, but then why should kids do the homework if they're not getting a grade for it? And again, so this is a philosophical question, number one, but number two, it's a pedagogical question too, because really what needs to change is the homework has to be meaningful. And here's another like, this isn't a secret, we all know it, but lots of times homework is not meaningful, right? Or classwork is not necessarily meaningful. So we need to make it meaningful. We need to make it transparent to kids how that practice is specifically going to help them to prepare for that summative assessment, number one, and also just for these skills that are important for their lives beyond the assessment, right? We want to make the learning authentic. It's really important to them, and to show them that practice is really important too. And that's where, you know, the effort is part of that. But the point is here, the point is that we're trying to shift from extrinsic motivation, which grades traditionally are, right? The carrot, the stick, to intrinsic motivation. Get kids really to care and to do it because it's important. And so that shift is huge for them. And learning not only in my class, but in learning in life and throughout the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, I think with the motivation, and I'd be interested to hear kind of what your thoughts are. But I think when you separate the grading from feedback, right? So you're grading the summative, but you're giving immediate quality feedback to the student, immediacy of feedback, specificity of feedback. That can be a much better motivator of practice than the final grade of it, right? What are your thoughts on that, right? Doesn't that kind of one of the ways?
Yeah, I agree, definitely. I think there's a couple things come to my mind. Number one is, yeah, that immediacy is important, and that can be tough, right? I mean, especially for English teachers, right? In essays and getting back as quick as possible. And so that's why I really try to make that feedback, especially early and often. In the unit, that is. So, because once we get to that summative event, right, hopefully they're pretty clear about where they're at, and they can explain that themselves. Like, they know what they need to do. And after that assessment, it's not, oh, I don't know how I did, I'll just wait to see how you score me. It should be like, oh, they know exactly how they did and what they need to do better, if they do in fact need to do better. So it's tough to give sometimes that immediate feedback, but it's so important. And I think building that feedback, especially earlier on in that unit, can be really helpful for that, because when you have essays and things like that, it takes longer to give feedback, but there are lots of tools and kind of tricks and things that
well, let's
can be helpful.
Circle back to the feedback at the end. And I know we're going to touch briefly on the practice of rubrics and conferring, and both of those can help the immediacy. It can help specificity in different ways, I think. Do you feel like we can move on to kind of the next, I would say, cluster of issues, because they're related, although they're different elements, the points-based element, percentages, and zeros?
Yeah, sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay. So, do you want to stay kind of looking at the slide, or do you want to go back to kind of the regular? Does it help to have the slide up there?
Yeah, we can stick with it if that works. I think maybe just for kind of a guide, that's good. So you want to go to the point system then?
Yeah, if you could just touch on it, and then entering this, I know that we've used the word equity a lot. It's a buzz term, but we don't want it to be a buzz term. I don't think either of us view it that way. We have there's very specific meaning behind it. Could you briefly talk about that term? I think it's in your slides as well, correct?
Sorry, Beau, you wanted me to talk about the equity term?
Define, the term equity.
Sure. If you go to slide 6 real quick. Yeah, I guess we probably should have did this at the beginning, but that's it. Yeah. So I think it's really important to keep this in mind, really, in all educational decisions. And I have a slide, a couple slides later, that just says like grading through an equity lens. And so we're just keeping the entire time we're thinking about equity. And so this particular definition is modified from napequity.org, and I think it's a pretty good one. And I think it's important to start with a common definition, because there are a lot of different types of, there's just a lot of different types of definitions, and it's important to be specific. So let me just kind of go off of a couple, I'm just gonna read off it a little bit. So in educational equity, different from other types of equity, we're talking about educational policies, practices, and programs necessary to eliminate barriers based on gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, color, family income, disability, age, and other protected group status. So those barriers. And then secondly, to provide equal educational opportunities and ensure historically underserved and underrepresented populations meet the same rigorous standards for academic performance expected of all children and youth. So that second part, what that brings to mind for me is that idea of, it used to be, this is an old-fashioned term, but it used to be called the gentleman's C. It's the kid who comes to class every day and they're nice enough, they do most of their work. All right, you get a C because, you're a pretty nice kid and you're not necessarily, you didn't learn all this stuff, but you get a C. Now, so the second part of the definition, really what that says is we are doing a disservice to our kids when we're just passing them along just because we feel like we're being harsh if we're going to fail them or we're going to give them a D or an F. But we have an obligation. We have and it's an equity issue. If we do not give them an accurate grade, right, we're doing them a disservice in their life because eventually that's going to come back to them, right? Like they're not going to know how to do an essential skill. And that's going to be a major problem for them in their life. That's assuming that those learning targets that we said are essential are truly essential.
Josh, real quick, not to interrupt you, but just to kind of use this organic turn of our conversation. I've talked to you before as we were getting started. We have some of the common "what about" questions you get, and I saw you presented Kate, and you certainly were getting the usual "what about" questions. Which is, I think, natural as teachers see some of these things and tools that they think are tools, maybe not serving them as best they thought. I think this is an okay place to throw in the "what about." I'm sure you get a lot of pushback. What about the real world, where they're saying this grading in this way, right, is a really good quote. I didn't start with it, but I'm going to put it in here. Is grading. Equitable grading shouldn't be a carrot or a stick. It should be a mirror. But it's really hard to shift that idea of students are going to do things or aren't going to do things a particular way if the grading's not there. And if you can't use it as a carrot or a stick, how are they going to be ready for the real world, right? The real world has deadlines. The real world, you have to show up. You have to have a deadline. You have to suffer consequences for late work. You get zeros in the real world, right? So could you kind of speak to that "what about" question?
Yeah, sure. That's one of the most common ones that I hear. And to me, this is one that I really, I understand that teachers have this concern, but I think it's not a realistic concern because, and here's why. First of all, in so many different parts of our lives, I'm not going to call them real lives because I think that really it doesn't give credit to kids that they don't have a real life, that they're not living in the real world because, as we've talked about before, a lot of our kids' worlds are realer than ours. If we think about kids who are homeless or who are, they have a hard time getting food each day or things like that. I mean, what does the real world mean exactly? I don't know. I'd ask for a definition first. If we're going to really continue that conversation any further. But I tend to see that when that's brought up, that's the end of the conversation. But, so often there are second chances, right? You think about how many times have you been in a meeting before, and you're there on time, and then you have people that are coming in late, right? Like, are they given a warning, like one more time, and then you're fired or something? Or even like an administrator or something like that, right? This happens a lot. Now, it shouldn't happen, right? We want to keep each other accountable. And so in meetings in schools, what we do is we have norms lots, right? And we want to remind people or maybe call them out or whatever, but we want to make that clear. And it's kind of a learning process and things like that. So I think the same kind of idea has to happen with our kids too. Same thing goes with retaking major exams possibly. Like if you're taking, let's say what are some of the big exams for like lawyers and things like that? You can retake those exams, right? So I think the bottom line is there are oftentimes chances to retake in real life, and it is not necessarily a high stakes on every single thing. But the bigger idea too is these are kids that we're talking about. These are kids, and their brains are still developing, right? And so we know that based off of brain science, and it's our job as educators to teach them in this process. And one of the follow-up questions too that I might be jumping ahead a little bit is, If you don't grade things like behavior, then that means you can't address it all. Wrong. In fact, what I find is when you don't grade things like behavior, you can really teach it for the first time. You don't just fall back on the grade and feel better about yourself. Like, oh, I gave them, a 0 for today, so I don't have to worry about being upset about them being late to my class. You didn't do anything to them, right? So there's lots of research that shows giving Fs and giving zeros for the vast majority of kids, that's not motivational. If it was, then those kids who've been getting Fs all their lives, they wouldn't be getting Fs all their lives, right? They would have learned like way back in 4th grade, and they wouldn't be getting Fs. But they don't learn from that, right?
Yeah.
And it's not something that gives them motivation.
If I could interject, just to support and echo what you said, I was going to jump in there. Yeah, it really does. Just it goes into the motivation element, and it certainly goes into teaching is not grading, right? It's not a carrot or a stick. It's a vehicle to communicate learning. And especially, I believe there's a piece in Feldman's book that I saw where it lists a ton of different studies. It's talking about grading doesn't motivate, and grading doesn't teach soft skills well. They're better taught with restorative practices through an understanding of the social emotional learning framework and with quality feedback and building community. For example, I will have students sometimes swear in my class. Putting a grade on that and marking them down or up numerically for swearing is not going to motivate them not to swear. It's not going to help them learn not to swear, even though professionalism is a real world skill. I mean, it's way better that I model professional behavior. I talk about, and they see it practiced in a community of learners striving for that. I give them quality feedback in a restorative way. That's way more effective. I can't even imagine just penalizing with grades, because that would not be a good way to teach those kind of skills.
Yep. Same thing goes with plagiarism, right? And so who better to teach about plagiarism than English teachers versus just giving, the 0, which is, and that's one of the biggest, most common uses of the 0, I think, is for instances of cheating and plagiarism. But if we go back to the definition of grades, again, that grades represent student learning. Well, 0, and so we get to one of the other problems of 4 major problems that I kind of say with grading is the assigning of zeros. And so if grades represent student learning, then 0 represents 0 learning. And in my experience, I've had very few kids, and I can't think of any in particular that come to mind, that literally show 0 learning. And I don't mean 0 evidence of learning, because you get the kids who, once in a while, you get those kids that just don't come almost ever, right? But again, 0 would mean 0 learning. And when we use zeros for things such as plagiarism, cheating, and other things, just not turning in work, it's inaccurate. And it's also inequity issue too. So really what I think this allows is us to teach that behavior, right? So what I'm able to do, what I found myself able to do, because I do not mix the teaching of behaviors with grading, is I can address plagiarism, for example, straight on. I can have a conference with students and talk about, let's really talk about, no, let's really talk. Let's not have grades on your mind right now. What's the problem with this, right? Why is this an issue? You've said this is your work, but it's not. What you've done is you've lied here, right? That's a problem. You've lied to me, and you've lied to other people who are going to read this paper, right? Maybe you've lied to your parents and others. That's a problem, right? And that's not integrity. I really think integrity is important.
Yeah, to jump in, I talk about them seeing the consequence beyond a grade, right? If I say if you were on the football field, right, and I'm teaching you how to run a route as a wide receiver, and you have your identical twin sub in and put on a helmet and pads, you cheated the system. Well, what's going to be the problem later on, right? You cheated yourself out of the opportunity to actually learn a particular skill, which has nothing to do with the grade, right? That's qualitative feedback, helps them understand it. 0 is great. I think it would help if we back up just a little bit, because 0 is kind of problematic symptom of the percentage scale. Could you talk a little bit? You can continue talking about the 0, but also kind of the issue with the percentage scale and your solution for that kind of solves. I know once you move into a different measurement than the percentage scale. It kind of addresses the issues with the zero and the percentage scale.
Yeah, sure. So the problem with the percentage scale is again, this is another one of these traditional grading practices, and it really doesn't have a lot of sense to it if we really think about it. So the percentage scale has 101 different levels of performance levels, 101, 0 through 100. And really, theoretically, each one of those levels is supposed to mean something different, right? So in any scale that you have, whether it's 4 or 5, which I suggest, and the research it clearly suggests 2, maybe as many as 7. But even in the case, so let's say somebody, they're very adamant, say, no, I want to use the percentage scale. Okay, then what that means is you need to define each individual level. So, okay, what does a 1% mean? What does a 2% mean? What does a 3? That process would be so ridiculous. I think someone would give up after the first couple levels.
Right, because if you're saying,
really what
well,
that means
feels, I think educators mentally say, well, this feels like a 73, not a 77, right? And that you don't want it to be that arbitrary. You want it to be these real clear measurements.
Right. They must. Yeah, if they're going to be accurate, they have to. Right. So it's an accuracy issue, and so that's why we want to stick to 4 to 5 levels. And that's what research says that what human beings, right? We're talking about just humans and the way our brains work. We can do this consistently, and we can do it accurately. So percentage scale doesn't make a lot of sense. It's another one of those traditions. And so solution to this, and my suggestion and what I use and lots of teachers do as well, is a 4-point scale, right? So you just use something that's what is very intuitive, especially for high school, because we use a 4-point scale, where a 4 traditionally is an A, a 3 is a B, a 2 is a C, a 1 is a D, and then a 0 would be an F. So that's technically on the scale. And I think it's really best to avoid zeros at all costs. And sometimes that requires the teacher to use alternative forms of evidence if a student doesn't show up for an assessment, or they don't turn in homework, or whatever it is, right? But especially we're talking about summative assessment, where we're finding other forms of evidence, because again, if a 0 represents, if grades represent learning, a 0 would be no learning, and that's fairly ever the case. And so this is much more accurate. Now, let's say that somebody is really hesitant to get rid of the 0 for whatever reason. Now, I think it's something that I would strongly recommend that somebody does, that teachers do. But if they transition to the 4-point scale, then the 0 is much more, it's a lot less harsh, because the 0 on the percentage scale is ridiculously harsh. When you use that for student, it's an extreme form of punishment. And the reason is because if we look at, and so Beau, if you're going back up to that percentage scale. I got avoid
zeros right up on right there. Should be right there.
Sure, that works too. So if we assign a 0 on the percentage scale, well, we take a look at that F range on the percentage scale. It's from usually 0 through 59. So 60 different levels of failure. Why on earth would you need 60 different levels of failure, right? And unless you're somebody who you really, I'm kind of making light of this whole topic here, but unless you really enjoy describing failure, why would you don't need that many. Nobody needs that many, and we can't do that accurately, right? So just to get to a D, which is still a bad grade in most people's minds, you have to go, what, 60 different levels up just to get to a D. Right, and we're not even talking about a good grade here. So it's harsh punishment when you give 0 on a percentage scale. But if you transition to that 4-point scale, a 0 is not as harsh, right? So the next level up to a D it's 1 level instead of 60 levels. So it's a lot less harsh. I still recommend not using zeros, because I think usually it's inaccurate, and it's on the teacher. I think it's on the teacher to find evidence. It's not necessarily on the student to go in and bring that evidence. I think of it the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. So could you touch, we touched on, so just to recap, we kind of wandered around a little bit, but that's the nature of podcasts, is kind of an organic flow to it. And I tried to not
We have
right?
jumped a little bit.
You want it to feel like a conversation with little tangents and different things. So we touched on, that's what I enjoy about it. And I'm sure we'll get more organized as I practice this. But we touched on really avoiding grading summative, grading formative already, focusing on summative, but then allowing for retakes, avoiding zeros, right? So you can get an accurate summative, and then allowing learning to happen to push students towards that continued learning and then report. Avoiding zeros, we touched on that as well. The 4-point scale, I think, helps when no learning has happened, kind of a balanced look at no learning happening rather than, like you mentioned, 60 levels of no learning happening, which is such a great point. Penalizing with late grades, penalizing participation, that we touched on that as well. Could you, I think the one that we maybe, right, because if you can, participation effort grades, right, that's the soft skill that's not taught well through the grading system, but rather through feedback apart from grading. Could you talk a little bit about points, and then I think we'll have captured some of your main reforms.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the problem with points is another one of those traditional things, and the problem with points is it's again that carrot and stick kind of a thing. So when the classroom revolves around points, then the only reason students do anything is to get a point or to not lose points. And so it's really used as this kind of token economy. Kids do something small and they're expecting some points, right? But they come in late, like, oh, we got to take away points. And so it's always just about giving and taking away points. And when you're talking about points all the time, what you're not talking about is learning, right? You lose that focus of learning.
Because
so it's just the wrong conversation to have.
Yeah, because it breaks from learning and turns into, I think, what many educators refer to as the game of school, right? Which is this game of, right, pursuing grades, chasing the points, right? Are you earning enough points to get the grade you want? And it's a game, and you really see students view it that way. And often, right, they view it as this arbitrary judge of the game, right? Where they're like, most common question, right? Students say, why did you give me X, right? Thank you for giving me X. Where it's a game, and really the way the students talk about it, it's a game that they're terrified they're not playing well. So I think if you could talk about that as well, I wanted to echo, that the issue with points relating to that.
Yeah, sure. You know, I think what we find, especially in certain classes like AP and GATE and honors classes, we get kids who they play the game especially well, right? And they know all the things, all the tricks, to bring in the Kleenex and to sit in the front of the class if they get a chance, and to shake the judge's hand or the teacher's hand, and to say, have a good day before you go. Like, all those things are good.
If I dress up as my favorite zoo animal, am I getting 5 points?
Sure, you wear school colors on Fridays or whatever. Now, so by the way, this is an equity issue because they know that a lot of times they know this stuff is they oftentimes taught by the parents. You know, like, this is what you need to do, and you know, so parents who've gone through the process and they've been successful themselves, and they've gone oftentimes to college and or graduate school and things like that, they can teach their kids to do that. But students who have parents who haven't gone through that, you know, they don't necessarily have those skills to play the game, and therefore they're kind of behind from the get-go. But again, it's not talking about the learning that's the problem. And I can tell you just firsthand, I am extremely glad not to have those conversations really much anymore. They come up once in a while, but those are the things that as teachers, when you have to have those things, those conversations. You know, when you have the kid who comes at the last day of the semester and they're asking, like, what can you do? What can they do to bring up their grade? And like, can they turn in this, you know, little assignment or something? Like, you know, we're having the wrong conversation, but it's great to not have to have those conversations because it's not about learning. And the last thing I'll just add in about that too, if I can real quick, is for teachers, this is the thing we got to get over. For teachers, if we're gonna be honest about it, points is about power, right? So a lot of times it's how we've traditionally dealt with student behaviors, and teachers worry whether they acknowledge this or not, that if they cannot grade down on behavior, you know, what are they going to do when a kid doesn't want to do something, or they don't want to do their assignment, or they come in late? Or
yes, the carrot or the stick, right? They view it as a tool, like a carrot or a stick, right? It's going to motivate if I offer extra
right.
credit, extra whatever, or I'm going to take points off.
Right.
You don't want what's it? Well, shame on me for blanking on this. Oh, you don't want the Hogwarts version of school, right? Where points to your house, points to that house, points to, right? You're taking points off, you're putting points on. You want to motivate differently in that system.
You know, as my students know, that you always lose me that when it's the Harry Potter analogy, because I haven't read it yet. I'm waiting until my daughter gets old enough to read it. Okay, so I know every time I say this, people are just kind of aghast, like, "Oh, you haven't read Harry Potter." Okay. So I get the idea, though, and so yeah, I generally agree. And but teachers have to find other ways to deal with those behaviors to really teach them and to make the grades really about learning.
Hey, so to kind of head into the final segment, it won't be too long. I know we're running a little bit longer. Circling back to feedback, we talked about it earlier when we talked about separating grades, teaching soft skills through feedback. But then, grading an equitable way frees you to give quality feedback and use that as the tool in the practice part of learning, right? Heading towards that summative assessment. Could you talk a little bit about, I know there's arguments for rubrics. I've seen some arguments that rubrics can be somewhat of a generic tool for giving feedback to student writing, and then also kind of balancing that with conferring. Can you talk about the tools of rubrics and conferring in leveraging your feedback mid-process?
Sure. I'll just mention a couple things because I understand that you're going to be having another guest to talk more about rubrics. And so one thing I would say, as much as possible, I think it's important for teachers to co-construct rubrics and success criteria with students. So to make the criteria for proficiency usually is what we jump to and what we target with kids. And it takes a while to get them to that point. But if you can do this, it's very powerful because that means that they can help to internalize those requirements for proficiency. And so they can internalize that just to know the targets, to know what you're asking for. Again, that is very powerful, and it can help them to reach that proficiency. Obviously, clarity is a really important thing. John Hattie talks about this and documents this in his research. So that's a big thing, I'd say. Number two, I would say, is also to use the rubrics throughout the unit, right? As a teaching tool, as a learning tool. It's not just one of those things that we want to staple on the back of our essays once we return it to kids, just so we feel better about ourselves. We want to use it throughout for clarity purposes. We want to use it to guide our own feedback, because we've said this is what it means to be proficient. This is what it means to the other different performance levels too, but especially proficiency. I think it's important to focus on. But our feedback should align to that. And eventually, when students are doing peer feedback, they're using the same thing. Again, when they are internalizing those requirements for proficiency, when they can apply to somebody else, when we know this, it better, or you really know something when you can teach it to somebody else. So part of the peer assessment process and the peer feedback process is the teaching process, and it helps to internalize that. And then finally, I think when they can self-assess too, because I think that's kind of the end of that continuum, is they can really take the emotions out of their own work, and they can decide and they can explain whether it's to a partner, or to the teacher, or to a counselor, or to their parents, where they're at and why, and knowing where they need to get to, and then how they get to that too. So using it is part of those rubrics, as part of the whole learning process, I think is really important.
Yeah, I have struggled with, I think, clarity in feedback, especially in how my feedback fits into what our aim is, what's our learning target, what are we moving towards, right? And creating an effective feedback loop, right? You need that clarity of intention and connect it to an organized approach. But then also, I have found things like there's various types of rubrics, and I'll get into that later. But there are things like a single point rubric that allows you to give individualized writing on two sides of grow or maybe needs work or needs work or exceeds. Could you talk about how you use conferring though and in coming alongside students to give that individualized feedback, which is very important for writing as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just mention real quick, you mentioned about the single point rubric, and I know we're not going to get into distance learning right now because that's a huge topic. I think the single point rubric is huge for distance learning, especially for schools that are going credit, no credit, or credit and incomplete, because that credit, one rubric, you know, whether it's just proficient or whatever it is. And I think it's really helpful. Anyway, that's just another topic. So yeah, conferring, I think that it's really important to give really what qualitative researchers call thick description. And we just give more depth, and it's the context and then going back and forth, kind of like what we're doing right now. And I think it's important. So in the English classroom, I think it's important for writing and also for reading. But it's just having those conversations, and it's that instantaneous feedback. I think is really important. At least one full cycle in each unit, I think, meaning getting through all students at least one time thoroughly to have the conference. And when I conference, I have the rubric that's there as well. And I ask kids to come with what I call a growth target or a growth standard of what they need to focus on the most, right? Because what I found early on is kids, you know, they might come to me and say, can I have some feedback on my essay? And, you know, I might ask, so what would you like some focus on? Just everything, you know, just, and everything's a lot, you know?
Or the most common one, even if a student provoked, whatever, does this look good, right? Is this good enough, right? And that's such a, not the specificity you want to pursue.
Right. And in those cases, I find that kids, when they ask that kind of a question, they are not really themselves. They're not focused on those standards. Those standards or those learning targets. They haven't really internalized what it takes. They don't have really a concept of that very as clear as possible. So I ask kids to come in with a growth standard. We focus on that, especially because it's a time issue, because it takes a long time to get through all those conferences. And then if there's extra time, then get to other standards as well.
Yeah. So I think, right, grading the right way, which means not using it as a carrot or a stick mid-process, because that's just not effective, but using it, right, as a mirror of that summative, what learning has happened assessment, and then using various types of ungraded formative assessment to leverage feedback that's immediate, which I think rubrics serve a good tool for that. That's individualized as well, though, which conferring can be a tool when it's done intentionally and systematically. And we could spend hours talking about all these topics, but I'm going to move towards the end. So we're going to talk in later podcasts. I'm going to get into instructional design, looking at using rubrics as feedback, co-construction, all that. But could you kind of any final thoughts you want to mention? And then could you mention some of the other books if someone was to dive further into researching equitable grading?
Yeah, sure. So final thoughts, I'd say, be intentional about grading practices. Start with the definition. You know, I suggest, as does the research, but feel free to check it out yourself. Gradings represent student learning of those prioritized standards, and the primary audience is to students and parents. So do not default on those traditional grading practices, because by and large, they've been ineffective. And I think it's kind of a harsh truth, but you know, we need to accept that. We need to embrace that. So really get away from that hodgepodge grade. But so when you make these changes, the important thing to keep in mind is you need to communicate. You need to communicate very well, because lots of people are not going to understand these practices, unfortunately. You need to communicate to your administration, to other teachers, to students, to parents about what these are and why. So make sure you fully understand them. And I think hopefully what you'll find, like I find myself, is once you fully understand them, once you do the reading and you really thought through them yourselves, like Beau mentioned before, don't do too many at a time, do a manageable number. But once you're able to do that, and when people push back, then you'll have no problem having conversations. In fact, I invite people to have conversations. I invite people to push back, because I think it's good for me to be thinking about this continuously, but I want to inform them as well. So communication is really key.
You mentioned 14 possible reforms. You didn't do all 14. How many did you do?
Oh no, just to clarify. So I'm using 14 reforms. You know, I haven't in getting back here, and I'll make a couple other book recommendations. So in Joe Feldman's book, you know, I didn't count up all the individual grading practices and policy recommendations you have, but I have. I don't know if you want to. Oh, we already went away from those slides. I have 14 different. Okay, I have 14 different reforms that I'm employing this year.
Okay.
Some of which are new and some of them are not in my own classroom. So, but it was a gradual thing for me. I didn't start from scratch, you know, and just go all in this year. That wouldn't be a good thing, I don't think.
Well, your recommendation for educators wasn't all 14, right? It was a couple from each tier.
So I would say if you're going to start out, my recommendation would be, well, first of all, everybody's different. So it's not an easy thing just to say, hey, this is what everybody should do right now. But some of the easier things, change from the percentage scale to 4-point scale. That's an easy thing. Really, for the most part, it's just like a grade book change, right? Just, you got to know how to make your grade book do what you want to do, because grade books are old school too. They are built for old school grading practices, unfortunately. Hopefully they'll catch up soon, but they're not there yet. I'd say that. I'd say also get rid of the zero as much as possible. That's an easy start too. And get rid of the points-based system. That's a big start. The thing that I find teachers to have the hardest time with is going 100% summative assessment. And although I think it's one of the most important in terms of accuracy and in terms of equity, but so you got to make sure you really understand it. And importantly, if you do make that change, which I suggest you do, or at least if you're not ready, by the way, to go 100% summative assessment, go 80%, and you can use still 20%. Ideally, you want to get to 100 for those reasons that I said before. But make sure when you're making that change that you have ways to address those other things like behaviors, effort and stuff like that. Because if you were relying on grades, then it's not going to be there. And if you don't have a solution for that, you're going to have problems.
I know one of them was creating a community of feedback, or I think a culture of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's excellent. And then when you go summative only, you are emphasizing standard-based skills, correct?
That's right. So let me point out a couple of books to help with that too. So I employ what's called standards-based grading. I won't talk really about that right now just for the sake of time, but here are some good books. I've written some things about it. It's just a time issue right now. Let's see, this book here by Tom Schimmer. He is a very good author, specifically in standards-based teaching and learning, learning and grading. This is called Standards-Based Learning in Action, Theory of Practice. Great book, has both of them, theory and practice. A lot of practice stuff, especially. That's a really good one. And then this is another one by Schimmer. This is by Schimmer et al. This one by Schimmer specifically about grading for standards-based grading. Thomas Guskey is one of the foremost grading researchers and writers in the last 20 years, I'd say. On Your Mark is about, there's a lot of theory things. I really recommend understanding the theory, being grounded in the theory. There is some application here too, but that's a good one that kind of documents especially a lot of the history of grading. And then there's a new one that just came out, last month, excuse me, called Making Grades Matter, and this is standards-based grading, and by Matt Townsley and Nathan Weir. So those are, those are 5 books that I would highly recommend. But even, just a couple of those would be pretty good to get a start.
Awesome. Well, Josh, it's been great. Our conversation's been a little meandering at times, but it has been fun.
Yeah,
I am crossing my fingers that our recordings go well. The shared recording attempt by both of us hopefully will make that happen, and I hope that this is something we can put up on YouTube this time. Just remember when you in signing off, it's going to take a lot of time to convert and kind of process the file. So you'll have to leave that running for a bit. But it's been great to talk to you. I'll link some of the slides with your permission, and link your Twitter and blog as well. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Have a great rest of your week. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Thanks for having me, Beau.
Okay, I'm going to click stop recording.